If you could travel back in time to the summer of the year 1324 and stand on the banks of the Nile River, just outside the great gates of Cairo, you would have witnessed a spectacle that defied human imagination and broke the boundaries of what was considered possible in the medieval world. You would have seen a cloud of dust rising on the western horizon that stretched for miles into the shimmering desert heat. As the cloud grew closer, the ground beneath your feet would have begun to tremble with the rhythmic thudding of thousands of hooves and the marching of tens of thousands of feet. But this was not an invading army coming to lay siege to the city. There were no catapults. There were no war cries. There was only the blinding glint of the sun reflecting off metal. And it was not the steel of swords. It was gold. You would have seen 500 slaves marching in the front rank, each wearing garments of Persian silk and each carrying a staff made of pure, solid gold weighing 6 pounds. You would have seen 80 majestic camels, each groaning under the weight of 300 pounds of gold dust packed into leather sacks. You would have seen a king dressed in robes of the finest brocade, sitting under a canopy of silk, surrounded by a moving city of 60,000 people. This was Mansa Musa, the emperor of Mali. He was passing through Egypt on his pilgrimage to Mecca. He looked like a god of wealth descending from the heavens. But the people of Cairo, watching with their mouths open, did not know that this man was about to destroy their lives. They did not know that his generosity was a weapon of mass economic destruction. They did not know that the gold he was handing out with a smile would poison their economy for the next 12 years. To understand this moment of economic catastrophe, we have to travel back to the source of this unimaginable wealth. We have to go to West Africa, to the Empire of Mali. In the 14th century, while Europe was struggling through the Little Ice Age and facing the beginnings of the plague, West Africa was enjoying a golden age of stability and abundance that rivaled any civilization in history. The Mali Empire stretched across the vast savanna encompassing what is now Mali, Senegal, Gambia, and Guinea. It was a land of peace and order. Travelers of the time wrote that a man could walk from one end of the empire to the other, carrying a plate of gold on his head, and no one would touch him because the law of the Mansa was absolute. But the secret of Mali's power lay beneath the red earth. The empire sat on top of 3 massive gold fields known as Bambouk, Bouré, and Galam. These were not just mines, they were geological freaks of nature. The gold was so plentiful that during the rainy season it would sometimes wash up onto the roots of plants. Farmers would find nuggets of gold while digging for yams in their gardens. For centuries, the miners of Mali had perfected the art of extraction. They dug deep shafts and sifted the riverbeds, producing tons of the purest gold in the world. At this time in history, the currency of the civilized world was gold. The merchants of Venice, the bankers of Florence, and the sultans of Cairo all relied on gold coins to conduct trade. And historians estimate that nearly half of all the gold circulating in the Eastern Hemisphere came from the mines of Mali. Every time a merchant in Italy paid for a shipment of spice or a king in France paid his soldiers, they were likely holding a piece of metal that had been dug out of the ground by a subject of Mansa Musa. Mali was the engine room of the medieval global economy. Mansa Musa came to the throne in 1312, but his path to power was strange and tells us much about the ambition of his people. The previous king, Abu Bakr II, was not interested in gold. He was an explorer obsessed with the Atlantic Ocean. He did not believe that the sea was infinite. He gathered a massive fleet of 2,000 ships, loaded them with fresh water and gold, and sailed west into the unknown, hoping to find the edge of the world. He never returned. Musa, who had been his deputy, was left to rule. While his predecessor sought new worlds across the ocean, Musa decided to announce the power of Mali to the old world across the desert. Musa was a devout Muslim, and he took his faith seriously. One of the pillars of Islam is the Hajj, the pilgrimage to the holy city of Mecca. Every Muslim is expected to make this journey once in their life if they can afford it. Mansa Musa could certainly afford it, but a king does not travel like a normal pilgrim. A king travels in a way that demonstrates his power to the world. He spent years preparing for the journey. He emptied the provincial treasuries. He conscripted an entire city of people to move with him. When the caravan finally left the capital of Niani in 1324, it consisted of 60,000 people. Imagine a football stadium filled with people all walking across the desert. There were soldiers to protect the king, there were scholars to discuss theology, there were poets to record the history, there were merchants to handle the logistics, there were 12,000 slaves to serve the court, and there was the livestock. Thousands of goats and sheep for food were driven alongside the column. The logistics of crossing the Sahara Desert with 60,000 people are mind-boggling. They needed water. They needed food. They needed fodder for the animals. The caravan moved like a slow glacier across the sands. As they moved through the desert, passing through the trade towns of Walata, and to what Musa began to spend, Musa did not believe in hoarding wealth. He believed that wealth was a gift from God to be shared. If he saw a poor person, he gave them a handful of gold. If he saw a mosque that needed repair, he paid for a new one to be built. It is said that he built a mosque every Friday wherever the caravan stopped to rest. He paid the Bedouin guides in raw gold dust. He bought provisions at prices that made the sellers weep with joy. The rumor of his approach reached Cairo long before he did. The merchants of Cairo were rubbing their hands in anticipation. Cairo was the greatest city in the Middle East, the capital of the Mamluk Sultanate. It was a city of trade where goods from India and China met the markets of Europe. The merchants knew that a rich king was coming from the land of gold. They expected to sell him silk and spices. They expected to make a good profit. They had no idea what was about to hit them. When Musa finally arrived at the pyramids of Giza, he set up camp. His camp was so large it looked like a new city had sprung up overnight. The tents were made of silk and brocade. The horses were dressed in gold trappings. The soldiers wore armor that shone in the sun. The Sultan of Cairo, al-Nasir Muhammad, sent an invitation to Musa. He wanted to meet this African king who traveled with the wealth of an empire. But there was a problem of protocol. In the Mamluk court, anyone who approached the Sultan was expected to kiss the ground at his feet. Mansa Musa was an emperor. He bowed to no man. He refused to go. The diplomats went back and forth between the camp and the citadel. The tension was thick. Finally, a compromise was reached. Musa agreed to go to the citadel, but he said he would only bow to God. When he entered the throne room, he walked past the Sultan and bowed his head slightly, acknowledging the other ruler as an equal. The Sultan accepted this and invited Musa to sit beside him. Then Musa began to give gifts. He gave the Sultan 50,000 dinars of gold. He gave gold to the viziers. He gave gold to the generals. He gave gold to the scribes. It was a river of wealth. The Sultan was charmed. He gave Musa the palace of the Carafa to stay in during his visit. This is where the trouble began. Musa stayed in Cairo for 3 months, and for 3 months he went shopping. He went to the famous markets of Cairo, the souks. He saw exotic goods he had never seen in Mali. He saw fine Turkish silks. He saw Venetian glass. He saw pearls from the Persian Gulf. He saw intricate brasswork and perfumes from Arabia, and he bought everything. He did not haggle. If a merchant said a piece of cloth cost 10 dinars, Musa gave him 20. If a trader said a horse cost 100 dinars, Musa gave him 300. He handed out gold dust as if it were sand. The merchants of Cairo thought they had died and gone to heaven. They had never seen a customer like this. They raised their prices. Musa paid them. They raised their prices again. Musa paid them. He flooded the market with gold. The shopkeepers of Cairo were suddenly sitting on piles of gold they had never dreamed of owning. The beggars in the streets were walking around with gold coins. The servants in the palace were tipping with gold nuggets. It seemed like a party that would never end. Everyone was rich. Everyone was happy. Mansa Musa was the most popular man in Egypt. They called him the Lion of Mali. They praised his generosity. They prayed for his long life. But while the people were celebrating, the laws of economics were beginning to work in the background. Economics is essentially the study of scarcity. Gold is valuable because it is rare. If gold becomes as common as sand, it loses its value. Mansa Musa had dumped so much gold into the Cairo economy that the supply of gold skyrocketed. Suddenly, everyone had gold. But the amount of goods, the silk, the food, the horses remained the same. When you have more money chasing the same amount of goods, prices go up. This is inflation. But this was not normal inflation. This was hyperinflation. The value of the gold dinar, the standard currency of the Middle East, began to crash. Before Musa arrived, a gold dinar could buy a certain amount of wheat. After he had been there for a month, that same dinar could buy only half as much. By the time he left, it could buy almost nothing. The merchants realized too late what was happening. They had pockets full of gold, but the gold was worth less and less every day. The price of bread doubled. The price of rent tripled. The savings of the middle class were wiped out. A man who had saved for years to buy a house suddenly found that his savings could only buy a horse. The poor who had received gifts from the king found that the money bought them very little food because the price of grain had soared. Mansa Musa had unintentionally nuked the economy of Egypt. He had killed the currency, but he didn't notice. He was a king, not an economist. He was focused on his spiritual journey. After 3 months of spending, he packed up his massive caravan and headed east toward the Red Sea to cross over to Arabia. He left behind a city that was drowning in gold and choking on inflation. As he marched toward Mecca, the legend of his wealth spread ahead of him. The Bedouin tribes of the desert heard that a man made of gold was coming. They lined the route, selling him water and guides at extortionate prices. Musa paid them without blinking. He arrived in Mecca and performed the rites of the Hajj. He circumambulated the Kaaba. He prayed at Mount Arafat. He gave alms to the poor of the holy cities. He gave so much that the markets of Mecca and Medina suffered the same fate as Cairo. He crashed their economies too. It is estimated that Mansa Musa injected millions of dollars worth of gold into the Middle East in a span of a few months. It was the largest transfer of wealth in the medieval world, and it was done with a smile. It was an act of charity that devastated the recipients. The exchange rate of gold fell by 25%. The entire region was awash in liquidity but starving for value. As we end the first part of this story, Mansa Musa is at the height of his glory. He has completed his pilgrimage. He is the most famous man in the world. He has spent a fortune that would bankrupt modern nations. But the journey is only half over. He still has to go home. And, as he turns back toward Africa, he is about to face a new problem. A problem that seems impossible for the richest man in the world. He is about to run out of money. The aftermath of his spending spree will haunt the Middle East for a generation, creating a financial crisis that historians will study for centuries. The journey home is often harder than the journey out. Mansa Musa had achieved his spiritual goal. He had stood before the Kaaba in Mecca. He had fulfilled his duty to God. Now he had to lead 60,000 people back across the unforgiving sands of Arabia and the Sahara to return to Mali. But the caravan that turned west was different from the one that had arrived. It was lighter. The 80 camels that had carried 300 pounds of gold dust each were empty. The staffs of gold carried by the slaves were gone, spent in the markets of Cairo and Mecca, given as alms or paid to greedy guides. The richest man in history was experiencing a liquidity crisis. He had spent so much so fast that he had literally burned through the treasury of an empire in less than a year. It seems impossible, but the scale of his entourage and the prices he had paid had drained him dry. The man who had crashed the world economy with his spending was now worried about paying his bills. As the caravan reached the port of Suez and prepared to cross back into Egypt, disaster struck. The winter of 1325 was harsh. The desert nights were freezing. The caravan ran out of food. The people began to starve. The camels began to die. The Bedouin tribes, seeing the weakened state of the great king, began to raid the edges of the column, stealing supplies and kidnapping stragglers. The glorious procession became a march of survival. The glittering robes were tattered. The silk canopies were torn. When Mansa Musa arrived back in Cairo, he was a changed man. The exuberant spender who had thrown gold at beggars was now a king in need of a loan. This is the great irony of the story. The man who had crashed the value of gold in Cairo now had to borrow gold from the very merchants he had inadvertently ruined. He went to the great lending houses of Cairo. The merchants were wary. The value of their currency was still in the toilet because of Musa's previous visit. Gold was cheap and goods were expensive. But a king is still a king, and Mali was still known as the land of gold. So they agreed to lend him money. But they charged him a predatory interest rate. They gouged him. They lent him gold at high interest, knowing that he would have to pay them back in fresh, high-quality gold from the mines of Bambouk once he returned home. So Mansa Musa effectively borrowed back the gold he had given away, but at a massive markup. He essentially financed his own economic destruction. But there was another twist. As Musa borrowed gold and removed it from the Cairo market to pay for supplies for his return journey, he inadvertently began to fix the problem he had caused. By taking gold out of circulation, he reduced the supply. The price of gold began to stabilize slightly, but the damage was deep. Historians record that the inflation caused by Mansa Musa's visit lasted for 12 years. It took over a decade for the economy of Egypt to return to normal prices. A 12-year recession caused by one man's vacation shopping spree. Musa left Cairo and headed west into the deep desert. The return journey was brutal. Thousands of his followers died of thirst and exhaustion. The desert does not care how rich you are. If you do not have water, you die, but Musa survived. And he did not return empty-handed. While he had lost his gold, he had gained something far more valuable: human capital. During his time in Cairo and Mecca, Musa had met some of the greatest minds of the Islamic world. He realized that Mali was rich in metal but poor in knowledge. He wanted to change that. He recruited architects, poets, jurists, and scholars to come back with him to Mali. He offered them salaries that were irresistible. One of the men he hired was an Andalusian architect named Abu Ishaq al-Sahili. This man was a genius of his time, a poet, and a builder from Granada. Musa paid him 200 kilograms of gold to come to Mali. When they returned, Musa set him to work. They stopped in the city of Timbuktu. At that time, Timbuktu was just a seasonal camp for nomads, a trading post on the edge of the desert. Mansa Musa decided to transform it. With the help of his new architect, he built the Jingureber Mosque, but they did not build it out of stone because stone was rare in the desert. Al-Sahili introduced a new technique. He built with mud bricks reinforced with wood. He created a unique style of architecture that still defines the Sahel today. The mosque still stands 700 years later, a testament to the vision of the king. It is a masterpiece of organic engineering, cool in the summer and warm in the winter. Musa also founded the University of Sankore in Timbuktu. He filled it with the books he had bought in Cairo. He encouraged the scholars he had brought back to teach. Timbuktu transformed from a dusty outpost into the intellectual capital of Africa. It became a city where books were more valuable than gold. Students traveled from all over Africa and the Middle East to study law, astronomy, mathematics, and medicine in Timbuktu. The Library of Sankore eventually held over 400,000 manuscripts, making it the largest library in Africa since the Library of Alexandria. This was the true legacy of the pilgrimage. The gold he gave away vanished, the inflation he caused eventually settled, but the knowledge he brought back built a civilization. He turned Mali from a rich mining state into a center of global culture, but the world outside of Mali did not care about the university. They cared about the gold. In 1339, a mapmaker in Majorca named Angelino Dolcer drew a map of the world. On it, he placed the King of Mali. But it was in 1375 that the legend was cemented forever. The Catalan Atlas, the most famous map of the medieval world, was created for the King of France. If you look at the Catalan Atlas today, your eye is immediately drawn to West Africa. There, sitting on a golden throne wearing a golden crown, is a picture of a black king. In his right hand, he holds a scepter. In his left hand, he holds a nugget of gold the size of a grapefruit. The caption reads, "This black lord is called Musa Mali. So abundant is the gold which is found in his country that he is the richest and most noble king in all the land." This image changed everything. Before this, Europe thought of Africa as a dark, unknown land. Suddenly they saw it as El Dorado. The image of Mansa Musa holding that massive nugget of gold burned itself into the European imagination. It sparked a hunger that would eventually lead to tragedy. Portuguese sailors began to sail down the coast of Africa looking for the river of gold. They were looking for the kingdom of Musa. This eventually led to the age of colonization. The wealth that Musa had displayed so proudly became the bait that drew the European empires to the shores of West Africa. They came looking for the gold, but eventually they took the people. The fame that Mansa Musa bought with his pilgrimage eventually led to the destruction of the very sovereignty he wanted to project. Mansa Musa died in 1337. He left behind an empire that was the envy of the world. But empires built on resources are fragile. After his death, his sons could not hold the vast territory together. The empire began to crumble. Raiders attacked from the north, rebel provinces broke away, and eventually the trade routes shifted. The gold of the Americas, discovered by Columbus, flooded the world, and the mines of Mali lost their monopoly. But the story of the gold crash remains a unique lesson in economic history. It teaches us about the nature of money. Money is a fiction. It is a shared belief. When Mansa Musa walked into Cairo, he proved that you can have too much of a good thing. He proved that an economy needs balance, not just an injection of cash. He showed that hyperinflation is not just a modern phenomenon created by central banks, but a fundamental law of economics that can be triggered by a single man on a shopping spree. Today, Mansa Musa is often listed in magazines and websites as the richest person of all time. They estimate his wealth at $400 billion, or even incalculable. But these numbers miss the point. You cannot measure his wealth in dollars because he owned the source of the dollars. He didn't just have money, he was the money. He controlled the supply of the global reserve currency. His story is a paradox. He is remembered as the ultimate symbol of wealth, but his most famous act was one of economic destruction. He ruined the lives of thousands of Egyptians by trying to be kind to them. He destroyed the value of his own fortune by trying to share it. He inadvertently taught the world that charity without economic understanding can be a curse. It brings us back to that image in the desert. The Golden King marching through the sand, dropping bars of gold while the merchants cry. It is a reminder that power without understanding is dangerous. Mansa Musa conquered the desert, he built great mosques, and he fostered learning. But he was defeated by the invisible hand of the market. He was the man who broke the World Bank simply by checking his balance. And in the end, the gold he gave away is gone, dispersed into the sands of time. But the lesson remains. True wealth is not what you have in your hand, it is what you build with your mind. Timbuktu's library lasted longer than Cairo's gold boom. The richest man in the world died, but the ideas he funded lived on. That is the real treasure of Mali. The gold was just dust, but the legacy was solid. This is John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it coming.